Good morning, everyone. Glad to see you here this morning. We have this weird thing that we do in church, and I guess it's just human nature. But it really doesn't matter if there are 100 people here, or how many are we here this morning, or 300 people here. We have a way of trying to fill up the space that is available. And so even though this morning, and here we are, the family of God, we all like one another, and I'm pretty sure everyone took a bath before they came to church this morning. We all spread throughout all four wings when we could all very comfortably fit right here. I'm not going to ask you all to move, but the reason why I bring that up is not because that's what we do, but that is what we do. But when we do that, I'm afraid what we do sometimes is that we let people sit alone that shouldn't have to sit alone, even right here at church. If there's one place that everyone should feel like this is where I belong, and people like that I am here, it should be at church, right? And so what I want to encourage us to do, and we're going to talk about this more as a church in the coming weeks and months, but what I want you to do as a church, be thinking about when you walk in here, especially if you, well, it doesn't matter if you come in early and find your spot, or if you're coming late, look for those people who have decided, who are sitting alone, and don't let them sit alone. It may be uncomfortable for them. They'll get used to it. But let's let each other know that we love one another and we love being together. Wouldn't that be a great thing? This morning, I want to start out this morning by telling you all I guess, a story of how things were when I was growing up. I think it's only appropriate, since we're going to be talking about the story, that I start off with a story. I grew up in, for the most part, in a little town called South Lyon, Michigan. Went to the Palmer Road Church of Christ in Wayne, Michigan, as I was growing up. And the Palmer Road Church of Christ looked like a lot of other churches of Christ, especially throughout the Midwest, and in the 1970s, and which is way back then when I was growing up. We had our order of worship. There was a way that we did things. We got the 5 accent, and it was done the same way every single week. But there was we were a Bible believing church, book, chapter, and verse for everything we said, and we wanted to make sure that we had Bible authority for everything that we did. We wanted to do Bible things in Bible ways. Remember all those slogans that we used to have, right? But there was a weird thing that just, I don't know why it was when I was a kid I thought like this, but I just did. That as I was growing up, I noticed that though we said that we were a church of the Bible, we were really a church of Acts chapter 1 through Revelation chapter 3. Now the reason why we stopped at Revelation chapter 3 was because, Revelation chapter 4 on gets kind of weird and it's hard to understand. And so preachers never preached on that. But also, preachers very rarely preached on the Gospels, which I found kind of weird because it's in the Gospels. The story of Jesus is told 4 times, 4 different ways. And you would think that that's pretty important. If a story's told 4 times in the Bible, you would think that that'd be pretty important, and that's what we need to preach on. But we didn't. What was preached on Sunday mornings was not the gospel of Jesus Christ, but was the implications of the gospel of Jesus Christ as it got worked out in Acts through Jude. And at the same time, and again, I went to Sunday school as a child. And so I remember in Sunday school, Sunday school, you'd go through the 2 or the 4 year cycle of the curriculum. Remember that? You remember? And you start in Genesis chapter 1, and you'd work your way all the way through all the stories of the Bible. And in Bible classes as children, we would spend about 3/4 of our time in the Old Testament because, the Old Testament makes up about how much of our Bibles? About 3/4 of our Bibles. In fact, the best stories outside of the life of Jesus, the best stories in the Bible are actually where? They're in the Old Testament. And so as kids, we'd spend an awful lot of time in the Old Testament, but the way that those lessons were used in Bible class when I was growing up, it was to teach us kids moral lessons. And then when you would get up into going to big church and be in the worship hour, the preacher would get up there and he would not preach out of the Old Testament. Now, he might refer to the Old Testament prophets every now and then as a prophecy was fulfilled in the life of the church in Acts chapter 1 through Jude, but he wouldn't preach from the Old Testament very much. And I thought that weird. Was the Old Testament just there to teach us moral lessons? And like I said, I grew up in church, and I was one of those that was there every time the door was open. You know, Sunday morning, back then it was at 10 o'clock, not this 9:30 stuff, this innovative thing that we do now. 10 o'clock, and worship at 11, and then came back at 6 o'clock, and then we were back on Wednesday night, and I grew up in the era of gospel meetings. You remember those? The era of the gospel meetings, which meant that especially during summer, there was a gospel meeting that you could go to every night of the week, somewhere within 50 miles of our home, and my family was one of those families. That if there was a gospel meeting within 50 miles of the church, it didn't matter if it was a school night or we went to the gospel meeting. And so I spent a lot of time in church. But what I realized as I grew up, that I knew a lot about the Bible. But I really didn't know how all the Bible fit together. What I didn't know was that there's actually one story that God is telling from Genesis chapter 1 to Revelation chapter 22, Revelation chapter 22, that is an incredible story that makes everything in the story make sense together. But because of the way that I was taught to approach the Bible as I was growing up, the only part of the story I really got was the Acts chapter 1 through Jude part. So I knew that that this book, this Bible, was supposed to make some sort of connection to my life, and it was supposed to make a world of difference in how I lived and my relations around me, but even me, a church-going, umpteen times a week child, grew up not knowing how to use the Bible in my daily life. It's just the way it was. For many who didn't grow up like I grew up, going to church at least 3 times a week, the Bible is even more confusing than it turned out being for me after I went off to college. But at the same time, most everyone who has a Bible knows that there's something important about this book. And that this book is supposed to say something about how people live. But for most people, they don't know what that is, and they don't know how to find it. And they're not sure how to read it in a way that will help them understand how to make the Bible a positive influence upon their lives. The average house in the United States, the average home in the United States, has in it 4 Bibles. Now, I drive that average up. There may be some of you that drive that average up too. But 4 Bibles in it. But only 41% of people who live in the United States say that they have ever read the Bible. And so they know the Bible's important. They have it in their home, but they've never opened it. And that should make us ask the question, why? Why is that? Why would they have this book but never open it? And one thing I think I've concluded is that it's not because they are they don't lack desire to know what the Bible says. Because if there was another survey that was taken that asked people, items on your bucket list. Y'all know what a bucket list is? All the things you want to do in life before you kick the bucket. All right, so that's the list. And one of the things that is on most people's bucket lists is reading through the Bible. And so what people are saying is that alongside wanting to jump out of an airplane and wanting to climb Mount Everest and wanting to go to Paris is also reading the Bible. But the truth is that most people, they're more likely to do one of those other items on the bucket list and are going to find it easier to do another one of those items on their bucket list than to read through their Bibles. Which is why I'm so excited about what we're going to begin together next Sunday. Because what we as a congregation are going to be doing beginning next Sunday and are going to carry us through basically the entire school year is that we as a congregation are going to go through the story of the Bible together so that we can see this great story of God that connects everything together so that all the different parts of our Bible maybe, hopefully, will make a difference in how we live as Christians. Again, when I was growing up, one of the sermons that our preachers, when I was growing up, always preached was that January 1st sermon. You remember that sermon? It was New Year's Resolution Sunday. And they would give us all these things that we are to have on our list of New Year's resolutions. And one of those things that was always on the New Year's resolutions was what? Read through the Bible this year. That was one of them. You know, other things that were on the list was like bring someone to Christ and other items like that. But one of the things that was always on the list was read through the Bible this year. And we in the Smelser household, there were 4 of us kids that grew up together, and my mom and dad, they made sure that we had Bibles, and so we all had our Bibles, and we would, Blinn and I don't live close to Highlands in comparison to a lot of you all. We drive, when I'm driving, it takes about 30 minutes. When other people are, well, never mind. But that's how far we lived away from church when I was growing up too. And so we'd have 30 minutes to drive back and forth to church, and in the daylight we'd be able to read in the car and we'd all have our Bibles open, and we'd start off the first of the year and we'd be reading the Bible together and trying to get through. And every year, we'd start off like gangbusters, and we'd start getting through the book of Genesis. We'd even make it through all the begets. You remember the begets? All right. In our modern translations, it's the genealogies, but it's the begets. And we'd get all the way through them and get to the book of Genesis, and then we'd launch into Exodus. And Exodus would be great because the Exodus was the 10 plagues, and that was great, and the Red Sea and Mount Sinai. And then we get to Exodus chapter 20. And you know what begins about Exodus chapter 20? All the laws. And really, from Exodus chapter 20 until you get to the end of Deuteronomy, all that you really have is the list of all these laws. And so most years what would happen is that we would screech to a halt. Well, Craig, would screech to a halt about Exodus chapter 20. There were years that I was better than other years. There were other years that I actually made it about halfway through Leviticus. But you know what happens about halfway through Leviticus? The laws that you read about in Exodus and in the first part of Leviticus start over again. And they start being said a second time. And so I would stop. I remember one year, I actually made it to the 4th chapter of Deuteronomy. But that's how far I made it. And even if I would have been able to finish as a child, I would think that what probably would have happened was that I probably still would have been confused about everything that I read. Because when you look at the Bible, you have all of these laws and psalms and incidents and other things that happen, genealogies in the Bible, and it's hard to really figure out how do they all fit together with one another. And so when you get to Revelation chapter 22, it's like, well, how does that relate to Genesis chapter 1 and everything that is in between? So it's hard to figure out how it all fits together. And what we're going to be doing as a church, beginning next Sunday, is that we're going to find that one story that ties all of it together so that it makes sense, not just as a whole, but also all the individual things that happened in it. There are just things in the Bible that you wonder, why did God choose to put it there? Like we like the stories of Samson in Bible school, right? But when you really look at the great story of God, sometimes you have to scratch your head and say, well, where does Samson fit into this? Or when you read the Song of Solomon, if you're newly married and all, it's nice to read the Song of Solomon, but unless you're in that category, you scratch your head and you kind of say, why is the Song of Solomon there? But if you knew the entire story of the Bible, all these disparate parts would fit together and make. Let me illustrate what I'm trying to say. In 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12, there is this incident, this series of events that happens in the life of King David. Now, King David is the great king, right? Of the king of Israel. He's the one who unites everything together, and he's going to be the king that leads to the lineage to the birth of Jesus, right? To the birth of Jesus. And Jesus is the big deal of the story, right? And so David's important. But in 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12, Jesus tells the Bible tells this story about David that just makes you scratch your head. It's like, well, if you want to have someone who leads to Jesus, why would you include that story about him? Because you know what happens in 2 Samuel chapter 11? 2 Samuel chapter 11 is the story of David, great king, has everything going for him, who goes up on his rooftop one night and looks down and sees beautiful Bathsheba and commits adultery with her. And she gets pregnant. And to cover up the pregnancy, what David does is, well, basically David has Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, killed. And he thought he got away with it. But then, as you go further on, you find out that a prophet by the name of Nathan has been told by God what David did. And so Nathan comes and tells David, you are the man. You are the one who has done this horrible sin against God. And David repents of what he has done. And then you go on into the rest of the book of 2 Samuel, and David just goes right on being king. And you're like, wow, how is that all he had to do was say, I'm sorry, and he gets to go on being king? Unless you already know, over in Psalms, there's a psalm called Psalm 51 that David wrote when Nathan exposed him as the man. Great penitential psalm. And if you ever get the chance of reading Psalm 51 and put it in the context of David repenting of what he had done with Bathsheba and to Uriah, then really everything that happens in 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12 make so much more sense. But where is Psalm 51? Psalm 51 is in this section of our Bible called the books of poetry. Our Bibles are divided up basically into the books in the Old Testament, the books of history, the books of poetry, the books of prophecy. Not chronologically, they're just placed that way, and there are different categories of literature. And so we have 2 Samuel chapter 11 in these early books of history, and then you have these Psalms in the early books of poetry, and unless you know to go back from Psalms chapter 51 back to 2 Samuel 11 and 12, you'll never know they're connected. But that's the whole story. And that's the way it is with the entire Bible. Where do the prophets fit into the history? And where do the letters fit into the book of Acts? And in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, y'all know what the Bible says? You probably quote this to me. Remember? Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? That's what it says. Revelation chapter 21 and verse 1 says, John writing, the Apostle John writing says, and then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. And if you read Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, and then you go to Revelation chapter 21 and verse 1, and you hear about this new heaven and this new earth that God's bringing down, it makes you ask the question, what on earth happened that God has to create a new heaven and a new earth? That's the story of the Bible. The story of the Bible is what happened from Genesis chapter 1 to Revelation chapter 21 that brought God to the point that he says, I am bringing a new heaven and a new earth down for my people to dwell in. The story of God, the story of how much he loves you, and the extent to which he's gone to get you back into his family. That's the story of God we're going to be learning about together. And I'm convinced if we can truly grasp what the story of God is, it doesn't matter how much of the Bible we know, whether you're as well versed as the most knowledgeable of our members here or a novice to the Bible. If you grasp this story, I believe it can change your life. Again, let me illustrate what I'm trying to say, because I want to make sure you understand what I'm talking about this morning. I mentioned earlier on your bucket list is going to Paris. Let's say that you got to go to Paris. And one of the things that you're going to do when you go to Paris is that you're going to go to the Louvre. You know the Louvre. The Louvre is that great art museum where all these famous works of art, all these paintings are. And chances are, if you go to Paris and you go to the Louvre, there's going to be one painting that you're going to see above every other painting there. It is perhaps the most famous painting in all the world, and that painting is called the Mona Lisa. Very good. The Mona Lisa. There's a picture of the Mona Lisa. And so you get up there and you get to where the Mona Lisa is, and first of all, you're kind of underwhelmed. Now, understand, the last time they gave a guesstimate of how much this painting's worth $900 million. All right. Painted by Leonardo da Vinci. But you would think that a painting that's worth this much, that is viewed as the most famous painting in all the world, that it would be like the size of a billboard. It's really about the size of a desktop. But anyways, you're looking at the painting, and you read on the plaque beside it a little bit about the story of the Mona Lisa, and you learn that this portrait was commissioned to be painted. This is actually Lisa del Giocondo. And this picture of her was painted after the birth of her second son. And you look at it and you think about the story of the Mona Lisa and what must have been going on in her mind as she has her second son. And you wonder, why is she smiling like that? Why didn't she at least show some teeth? But you're trying to think about her story and trying to relate to what it had been like to have been living back in the 16th century when this painting was painted and if you were to be asked at that point in time, or even now, what's the painting that is to the right of the Mona Lisa? Could you tell me? Probably not. And if I were to ask, what is the painting on the left of the Mona Lisa? Could you tell me that? Again, probably not, because it's really not that important. Now, it probably is to those artists, but the reason why it's not really that important as far as the Mona Lisa goes is because the Mona Lisa is one, not snapshot, but one picture that involves one isolated story that stands by itself. The picture on the right and the picture on the left are totally unrelated to the Mona Lisa. It's one story. Now, let's say you leave the Louvre and because you're like, I want to see some more art, you decide to get on a train and you take the train to Rome. And you want to see what is perhaps the second most famous painting. I'm not going to ask you to answer this one, but the second most famous painting in all of art, of all the art world. But it is in the Sistine Chapel. It's actually on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and that being the creation of Adam. And you think back to the story of God creating Adam as the strong finger of God is reaching out to touch and bring life to the limp finger of Adam. And as Michelangelo gives his interpretation of what that was like when God created Adam. And you think about that story back in Genesis chapter 1. And then I ask you, so what is the picture on the right of the creation of Adam? And you might be able to tell me. Because the picture on the right is related to the picture of the creation of Adam. What the picture on the right is the painting that Michelangelo did of the separation of the land from the waters by God. And if I were to ask you, so what's the picture on the left? You might be able to tell me what the picture is on the left because the picture on the left is the picture of God creating Eve out of Adam. They're connected to one another. They're all in one story. In fact, the reason why that is because the Sistine Chapel is not 400 separate portraits of things that Michelangelo wanted to paint. What the Sistine Chapel is that the Sistine Chapel is actually a mural. It's a tapestry of all of the story of the Bible from Genesis chapter 1 to the second coming of Jesus Christ. That is, and so you can, from the ceiling all the way down the walls, you have the story of the Bible. And you can see just by looking at these 400 paintings that Michelangelo did, God's story of the Bible. That's what this is. This Bible is not just 1,000 individual stories that all just got put in one book. The Bible is a tapestry. The Bible is a mural of interconnected stories that God has woven together to tell us His story of how much He loves us and what He has done to bring us back to Him. That's the story that we as a church are going to go through together beginning next week. And what I hope you get to see as we go through this is that when we get to chapter 31 of the story, that's all that's in the story, is 31 chapters. But when we get through the story, what I hope we all get to see is that chapter 31 is not the end of the story. I hope what we learn as we go through the story together as a congregation is that at the end of chapter 31 is actually the beginning of the story working its way into and being lived out through our lives. Because the story of God did not end in Revelation chapter 22. The story of God is still continuing today and is going to continue until Jesus comes back and throughout all of eternity. But now we have the privilege of being a part of that story. That just as God worked out His story through the lives of Abraham and Moses and Ruth and David and Mary and Paul, He's working out His story in our lives today. That we all have a place in God's story. In fact, when you think about it, every person who has ever lived and who's ever going to live has a role in God's story. You have no choice. Because you live in God's creation and you are one of God's creations, you have a role in God's story. The choice that you have is the role you're going to play. Because really there's two roles to play in God's story. You can either be a protagonist and work with God in accomplishing His story, and things will go much better for you. Or you can be an antagonist and work against God's story, and God still work through you to accomplish His story, but you deal with all the ramifications of trying to fight against God. It doesn't matter if you are the good guy or the bad guy in God's story. You're still in God's story, and He is still working through you and with you to accomplish His purpose. As we study the story together, there's going to be times when we're going to run into there's this concept of the upper story and the lower story in the Bible. That there's really two simultaneous stories that are going on in the Bible at the exact same time, which would make them simultaneous. The upper story is that story of God that I've told you about, the story about how God loves us so much that even though we went our own way and sinned against Him, He's done everything possible for us to be able to come back to Him because He loves us so much. But then there's this lower story, and this is all those individual stories we learned about in Sunday school, and the stories that about individuals and families and nations that when you tie them all together reveal the upper story, the big story of God. And it is this lower story that where we live on a daily basis. The lower story is the story of our getting up in the morning and making breakfast and going to work and getting on the bus and going to school and paying the bills and doing homework and doing chores and where we live. But it's as we do all those things that we allow God to work in our lives and through our lives to accomplish His purpose in the world. And the question for us is, will we align our lower story with God's upper story? Will we be an antagonist or a protagonist in God's plan for the world? That's really our choice. But what I want you to know is that God uses both. It isn't like you can say, well, I don't want to be a part of God's story. God, let me illustrate. Go back to the story of Joseph. Two Josephs in the Bible. There's more than that, but there's two Josephs that we know about most of the Bible. There's the New Testament Joseph. The New Testament Joseph was the stepfather of Jesus. All right, stepfather of Jesus. Old Testament Joseph was who? Old Testament Joseph was one of the sons of Jacob. Joseph was one of 12 sons of Jacob. And he was the favorite son. And his dad didn't hide from anyone that he had a favorite son. Some of you grew up in families like that where there was a favorite child and it wasn't you. You know what that's like, don't you? And so you can imagine what that was like. I mean, Joseph is the one who got the coat of many colors, and you know, Jacob probably wasn't going to win Father of the Year for doing this, but he let everyone know that because Joseph is the firstborn of my favorite wife, Rachel, right? All right, favorite wife Rachel, that he's my favorite son, and his brothers were fed up to here with Joseph, the favorite son. And then about the age of 14, Joseph has this dream. Remember the dream? He has this dream, and he doesn't keep the dream to himself. He likes the dream so much that he has to tell his brothers. And you know what that dream was? The dream was, one day you all are going to bow down to me. 14-year-old brother who is the favorite tells you that story. What do you think about that brother? You hate him even more, don't you? And so a day comes when they just can't take it anymore, and they end up telling their father that Joseph had been killed by a lion and was dead. But the truth was that Joseph was actually they'd actually sold Joseph into slavery in Egypt. That's the lower story, right? Sibling rivalry, brothers play the antagonist in the story, and Joseph ends up in Egypt. Now, the upper story, because there's something going on here more than just sibling rivalry and brothers who can't get along. What's going on here is that God has a plan that He's working out, and that plan is this. Back in early part of Genesis, God had promised to Abraham the land of Canaan, right? But in Genesis chapter 15, God told Abraham that He's not going to give him the land of Canaan yet because it wasn't time yet, that the wickedness of the Amorites had not reached its fulfillment yet. And so God needed a place to park the children of Israel while the land of Canaan got ready for them to take it as their land of promise. And so God wanted to park the Israelites in a place where they would not intermarry and pick up the religious habits of and not keep the lineage that was going to eventually lead to Jesus Christ, the big deal in the story, pure. And so he's going to park them in the one place in the world where he knows that they're not going to intermarry and get involved in all the idolatry of the nation where he places them. And that just happens to be Egypt. Why Egypt? You pick up on this as you read through Genesis, because the Egyptians saw shepherds as detestable. They'd have nothing to do with them, which is why when you go and listen and read the story, you see that whenever Egyptians and Israelites are eating together, the Egyptians sit at one table and the Israelites eat at another table because these Israelites are detestable. So God picks them up and moves them for, about 400 years and places them there until he finishes. But how did he place them there? He placed them there by getting Joseph to Egypt to prepare for them to get there. Now roll forward 22 years. 22 years later, we get to the book of Genesis, and right around chapters 47, 48. And what you find is that the other brothers of Joseph are bowing down to him, just like he said. And Joseph, while they're bowing down to them, Joseph says, "I am your brother." Now, when he says that, who is Joseph? Well, Joseph is now the second in charge in all of Israel, and so they're like, "Oh no, our brother now has all this power, and what is he going to do to us?" And these are the words of Joseph. When he talks to them about why he's not going to retaliate against them, he says, "It was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Who sent him to Egypt? Didn't they send him to Egypt? No. Joseph said, "God sent me. God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance, so that it was not you who sent me here, but God." You see what Joseph is doing here? Joseph is saying that even though it was the brothers who sent him, Joseph was able to see that God has a bigger plan that's working here that we're all a part of, and actually God used what you did to me to get me to where God wanted me to be, so all of us could move to Egypt. God uses antagonists to accomplish his plan. Another example, Acts chapter 1, verse 8. Jesus is about to ascend up into heaven, and I got to speed up. But Jesus is ascending up into heaven, and before he goes, he tells the disciples that they're going to be his witnesses. Remember what he said? "You'll be my witnesses to all people in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the uttermost parts of the earth." That's what he says. And so you go on in, Acts chapter 2 happens, 3,000, get to verse 47, we find that 3,000 people are added to the original 120. The church is growing like gangbusters in Jerusalem, but then you go the next several chapters in the book of Acts, and where does the church stay? The church stays in Jerusalem, but they weren't supposed to. They're supposed to go from Jerusalem out into Judea and Samaria and to the uttermost parts of the earth. And so how is God going to get them out of Jerusalem? Watch this. Acts chapter 7, end of the chapter, we're introduced to this antagonist who's holding the coats of a group of men who are stoning Stephen to death because of his being a follower of this new way, this follower of Jesus. And his name is Saul of Tarsus. And so Saul of Tarsus begins this great persecution of the church and starts killing Christians and starts dragging them into jail. And the only thing that the Christians in Jerusalem can do to get away from this persecution is to leave Jerusalem. And where do they go? Turn over to Acts chapter 8 real quick. Acts chapter 8. Look where they went in verse 1. They were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Right? All right. Go back to Acts chapter 1 and verse 8. Where did Jesus want them to go with the gospel? Jerusalem, then Judea and Samaria. And so Saul the antagonist, who thinks that he is doing great damage to the way, to these followers of Jesus, he is actually helping God's plan by getting his people out into Judea and Samaria so they can continue to spread the gospel like wildfire. And then, and this is great, You just turn your Bible over one chapter. And God takes and makes Saul the antagonist, Paul the protagonist. Remember the story, road to Damascus? Jesus has this miraculous encounter with Saul and reveals himself to him, and Saul becomes a Christian, and God changes his name to Paul. And in the midst of all this happening, God explains to a man by the name of Ananias why Saul is going to become Paul. And he says over there in chapter 9 and verse 15, "This man is my chosen instrument to carry my name before the Gentiles." And so the very antagonist who got the gospel out of Jerusalem and into Judea and Samaria is going to be the protagonist that God is going to use to get the gospel throughout the rest of creation. That's how God works. It doesn't matter if you're on his side or not on his side. He uses you to accomplish his purpose. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. That doesn't mean that it doesn't matter which side you pick, if you're going to be an antagonist or a protagonist, because what Paul learned is that it's much better to be on the protagonist side, on the good guy side of God's plan, than on the bad guy side of God's plan. And he wrote in Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, later on in his life, he wrote these words. I don't want to misquote it, so I'm going to read it. "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." You know what the Apostle Paul is saying there? The Apostle Paul is saying that if you are on God's side, in the end, everything is going to work out for your good. Now, he's not saying that everything that you're going through right now is good. And we know that to be true because we go through an awful lot of things that are not good. But what God has promised, that all the good things and all the bad things that happen throughout our lives, that in the end, all those things are going to be brought together and they're going to turn out for our good. That's the promise that God has made to his people. And so the question for us is if the promise of God is that it's all going to work out in the end for those who are on God's side, which side do we want to be on? And that's what I hope we discover as we go through the story together. If we can discover the story of God and align our lives with his story, it's going to all work out. What our roles are is to wake up every morning, align our story with God's story, and allow God to use it for his purpose and accomplish his plan. Let me skip to the end. You'll have to come back tonight for the part I'm about to leave out. Next week, we're going to launch the story together. At our Sunday morning worship, we are going to, afterwards, after the Sunday morning worship, we are going to give every member, every family unit here at Highlands a copy of the story. You'll get one as you leave the auditorium. And then Randall and John are going to preach through the entire story, all 31 chapters. And besides that, there's going to be Bible classes that are going to take place on Sunday morning and Wednesday nights that are going to do the story right here at the church building. And on Sunday nights, in the neighborhood Bible studies that we already have 66 people and 43 kids signed up to participate in, and here at the building at 5 o'clock, we're going to go through a Bible study of the story together as a church. And so we're all on the exact same page as we work through the story of God together as a family of God all over the next several months. And so what I want to encourage you to do, there's three things that I want you to think about doing. Number one, I want to encourage you to read all 31 chapters of the story. They're all about 10 pages long, and you're going to say, well, that's not very long. I can do that. Well, really the truth is a lot of us probably haven't read a book in a long time. But commit to reading through the story, all right? One chapter at a time. Let's read through all 31 chapters. Number 2, I want to encourage you, purchase a copy of the story for your neighbor. And give the story to your neighbor and invite them to come and be with us as a church to go through the story together. Because I believe that just as our grasping the implications of the story upon our lives will change the way we are as a church and as individual Christians, it can change your neighbor's lives. Change it for the good. And so invite them to join us. And thirdly, open your heart to the story. Align your life with the story like Jesus did, like Moses did, like Paul did. And if we would all do that, then all of us would have the opportunity of taking hold of that life that Jesus said is truly life. It may be that you're here today and you don't know where you fit into God's story, but you want to learn how. And you see this as a new beginning of being able to reset your relationship with your Creator and with your Savior. We're going to be singing a song here in just a minute. And it's going to be your opportunity to come up to the front here and let us know if you'd like us to pray for you. Or it may be that because of where you are in your relationship with God, you've come to the point where you've decided that you want to enter God's story through baptism today. You can come forward this morning and let us know that, and we will baptize you today. Because the story is about restoration. The story of God is about aligning our lives with God's purpose for our lives. And then living in the blessing of God because we are on His side. And He is on our side. If you're ready to take that step back into God's story today, why don't you come forward right now as we stand and sing together.
On bended knee I